Okay, so folks, this is going to be a little tough to have a comprehensive discussion with 25 of us, it looks like right now. Looks
that's
like
awesome.
more. But so don't be bashful, jump in. This will be most helpful to all of us if we all contribute to this. This is a very difficult and provocative book. So I want to know, I'll do most of the speaking, obviously, but I would really love to hear you challenge me or question me or tell the group your wisdom, okay? So let's open with prayer, shall we? God, we give you thanks for this perfect summer day and this beautiful summer evening and for bringing us together in this unusual way. We thank you for the author of this book and for many others who are trying to teach us how to get along with the other and to have a more perfect union in our land. So give us articulate speech tonight and listening ears and courage and compassion through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So I am hoping to be able to share my screen, and I hope you can see this. So Robyn D'angelo wrote this book called White Fragility. It's been at or near the top of the Times bestseller list for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then got another bump when George Floyd died. And from the very first page, first paragraph on page 1, we learn that we're in for a wild ride, because the first thing she tells us is an anecdote from her time as a diversity trainer at what is probably a for-profit business. She says there were 40 people in this seminar where she was trying to get them to be sensitive to each other's differences when a white man stands up, starts pounding the table, and yells, "A white person can't get a job anymore." And then Dr. D'Angelo looks around the room and sees 40 people, 38 of whom are white. And she asks, why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effect this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? I have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism. That anecdote was not very damning for me. I don't think I would have been inclined to do anything close to that, but this next one was. This is almost at the end of the book. She tells many anecdotes from her experience teaching diversity in corporations and nonprofits in the United States. On page 139, she tells about hiring a new web designer who happened to be black at one of her organizations. And the web designer asked the people from D'Angelo's organization to fill out a survey. And Dr. D'Angelo says, I hate surveys, I'm not gonna do it. I'll tell you verbally what we need. And then during the course of the discussion, Dr. D'Angelo is explaining to this web designer how difficult it is to do this diversity training. And she says that some of her colleagues aren't welcome in these settings. They don't want to be there, and they really don't like the people who are training in diversity. And so Dr. D'Angelo takes a black colleague with her and tells this black web designer, the white people are scared of Deborah's hair. So a couple days later, I think a white colleague comes up to Robyn and says, you know, she was a little bit offended by that remark. And so Dr. D'Angelo makes an overture to this person she offended, this African American, and begs for forgiveness. And in the course of this discussion, the African American web designer tells Dr. D'Angelo, that survey, I wrote that survey. I have spent my life justifying my intelligence to white people. So this expert on white and black relations in the United States on 2 different counts said something that was a little bit hurtful, probably a microabrasion on both counts to a black person. Now, this is an anecdote that this could have happened to me. Both the joke she made about her colleague's hair and and impatience with surveys. I would have said that without thinking about the effect on people. So I don't know if any of the rest of you are convicted by that, but I certainly was. Any comments about this anecdote or the first one, or any of the other ones that struck you in the course of this book? Moving on. This is Robyn D'angelo. She's Italian-American. She grew up in poverty, which marked her adulthood in significant ways. She also says that her mother died young, and this experience shaped her own life and work, because when Robyn D'angelo was younger, cancer was not something you talked about. It was shameful. And so I think she took that reticence about unpleasant things into her work about white fragility. She got her PhD from the University of Washington in 2004. I don't know what she was doing before then, because that means she was 40 or 50 when she got her PhD. She was a full professor at the Westfield State University in Massachusetts, and currently she's associate professor of the University of Washington and continues her diversity training. This is a line that we all need to remove from our vocabulary. I'm not racist. Do not say that. Dr. D'Angelo's point is that all white people are racist, even though race doesn't exist. At least genetically speaking, race does not exist. There's no such thing as biological race. It's a social construct, but it has profound significance and shapes every aspect of our lives. It influences whether we will survive our birth, where we're to live, what schools we attend, friends, partners, careers, money, and health, and even longevity. All of these things are determined partly by something that biologically does not exist. It's an evolutionary development based upon where your ancestors lived back to the 100th generation. And this was a convicting statement for me. I believe that white progressive caused the most daily damage to people of color. She defines a white progressive as any white person who thinks he or she is not racist, or is less racist, or in the choir, or already gets it. And white progressives can be the most difficult for people of color, because to the degree that we think we've arrived, we will put all our energy into making sure that others see us as having arrived. And then none of our energy will go into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, engaging in self-awareness, continuing education, relationship building, and actual anti-racist practice. Comments?
I could speak to that a little bit, only slightly different from the way it's presented. My name is Beverly Hayes. I don't know most of you, but I'm a friend of Bill Walsh's, and I am very interested in trying to become a better human being, which is why I'm here tonight. I actually feel a great deal of worry, because I want to try to make our world more equal for everybody. And my problem is that my anxiety about potentially offending someone in probably ways similar to what you described in your opening comments make me reluctant to say anything. So I quietly show my support, and I try to contribute to causes where I can, but I worry that I know I still have some biases. I try very hard to move past my upbringing and that kind of thing, because I see the importance and logic to everybody having equal access to things. But my worry is that I'm going to inadvertently say something that is offensive, because what I am learning a little bit along my journey is, just as an example, I shared with Bill recently that it is apparently not, you're not supposed to say to somebody, if you're sharing information about, for example, something that happened maybe where an African American was murdered during an arrest by the police, you're not supposed to say things like, I'm ashamed of my race, because then that puts the focus on you. And anyway, there are all these little rules that I'm sort of stumbling across, and I feel like, how do you know all this stuff? How can you be effective? How can you try to make things better if you don't know all those hidden details and protocols and things like that. So that is my worry. So this speaks to me a little bit, not exactly as it's written, but for a different reason.
Bill, I think that the intent is absolutely correct. It's very difficult for us to do, but I find that statement to be a little discouraging, because those of us that want to help, that want to change, are now basically saying, don't even try because it won't work anyway.
Actually, I took this quote, and I like this quote a lot, Bill. So thank you for pulling it up and putting it in your presentation. I see this quote as a hopeful quote. It's pointing out that for me, and maybe for many of you, I spent my life thinking I wasn't racist, and that the fact that just that concept may be the very thing that's preventing us from doing change. So that if we all now focus on the last sentence, start engaging more in self-awareness and reading and talking to people and building relationships, that is the positive solution to the problem. So I thought it's hopeful. Thanks,
Nancy. I want to thank Beverly for her comment too. I'm with you, Beverly. I don't know if, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but sometimes it seems like you're stepping through a minefield in these issues, right? Yes. So I get your point. We need to be very careful, but a word that's popped up for the first time in my hearing since George Floyd died is the word allyship. And so silence might be prudent, but it also can be not helpful. So that when somebody does say something racist, I think we need to be quick. When awkward Uncle Bob tells a racist joke at the Thanksgiving dinner table, we need to say something. So silence may be prudent, but it might not always be helpful.
I agree with you there. Absolutely.
Well, I was thinking.
Sorry, go ahead. I don't know who that was, but go ahead.
I was just saying that as I've been reading the book for 2 or 3 days, and I had that same feeling like, wow, this is a minefield. But then I realized that in my conversations with Jesus, I acknowledge that I'm tribal. I mean, I use the word tribal because I'm a member of this white tribe, and therefore I've got these aspects, and tribal people tend to stick together. And, you know, all the things that, for me, that tribalism means. It's not necessarily negative, but it's definitely, in the pinch, I think of myself and my tribe, my family. So this author has opened up for me a different way of looking at it. And, you know, I've got to do a lot of processing to figure out how it fits into, you know, anyway, getting back to my conversations with Jesus, I get the feedback that, John, who is your brother? You know, and you go through that whole thing. That means everybody on the planet is my brother and sister, because spiritually we're all related. And that to me is sort of I don't know if that's a cop-out. I don't know if I'm not denying racism, but I certainly, and at the moment I have no black friends. I have, except for in my fraternity, I have a black friend for my fraternity I've kept with all my years, but now I'm wondering if that is even a valid way to behave.
Well, I think Dr. D'Angelo would be pleased, John, that you admitted that you're part of a tribe and that you've been shaped by your tribe. She doesn't want us to pretend we're not part of a tribe, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So this paragraph was very troubling to me. She makes a list: 10 richest Americans, U.S. Congress, U.S. governors, top military advisors, president and vice president, presidential cabinet, TV shows, books, news, music, film. The gender is even more problematic than the race, I think. Dr. D'Angelo talks quite a bit about, as a white person, always knowing that she belongs in the world, right? She sees herself on television and film and books, magazines, billboards. She sees herself in her children's teachers, in most of her colleagues, when she goes to the doctor, when she talks to her guidance counselors at her children's school, when she looks at the paintings and posters we put up of our heroes, including Robert E. Lee. And she says, finally, I'm free to move in virtually any space seen as normal or valuable. And emphatically, as we have seen, that Black people cannot do that, move freely in valuable spaces. So here's a screen grab. If you Google Adam and Eve, I know you can't see this very well, but you can probably see my point. If you Google Adam and Eve, white people turn up everywhere. You have to scroll way down to find a person of color standing in for Adam and Eve. And hey, guess what? Adam and Eve weren't white, right? Where was the Garden of Eden? Well, the Bible says it was in Mesopotamia, but in fact, the first human beings came from where?
Africa.
Africa.
They were probably dark-skinned, right?
North Africa, yeah.
Here's a screen grab for Mary and Jesus. Now, it's not quite fair, right? All these are European paintings. But even into the 19th and 20th century, when we were waking up to a global world, we still continue to think of Jesus and his mother as white. This is probably what Jesus and Mary really looked like, right? The photo on my left is a reconstruction, an imagining of what Jesus probably looked like based on fossil remains of human beings from the first century in Palestine. The girl on the right is a Palestinian girl from early in this century. Screen grab, the scientifically perfect face. There's not a Black face on here. There's an Asian face, couple of Asian faces. Bella Hated, looks like she might have some African blood or Caribbean blood, or at least Moorish blood, but that's it. So that's what Dr. D'Angelo, that's why she feels like she belongs in this world. White is the default color for human beings. Everybody else is a departure from the default. So here's something very important. Dr. D'Angelo defines prejudice as prejudgment of another person based on the group to which she or he belongs. Discrimination is a behavior or action based on that prejudgment. And racism is when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of authority and institution. And so that's very important. She defines racism very narrowly. So people of color may and do hold prejudice and do discriminate against white people, but they cannot be racist. They cannot be racist because racism is not an event or a slur, it is the system. And so there is no such thing as reverse racism in the United States. Maybe there is in Africa, where white people are in the minority and Africans have power. And so this is a long quote, but let me just try to summarize it as quickly as I can. People resent being called a racist by Dr. D'Angelo, and she concedes part of their point. If what they mean by a racist is that you consciously dislike another person because of her ethnicity or the color of her skin, then you're a racist. But that's not what Dr. D'Angelo means by being a racist. She's talking about the system that makes people of color second-rate citizens, okay? Comments or questions?
I think one reason that am I being heard? Hello? Yep. Okay. Yep. I think that the progressives, her statement was made earlier about how liberal folk make things worse. And I think that's partly because we've been taught racist is a bad thing. We aren't racist because we're nice people. And we wouldn't be a bad person. We wouldn't be a mean person. But in fact, when we focus that way, we're thinking about us much more than others. And we end up, it's hard to define, but it ends up being rude and self-serving in an odd way. And it's because we don't want to be seen as nasty. Oh, I have a friend who's Black. Oh, I hang out with Black people. Irrelevant. It's not about you and who you hang out with. It's the identity. And a great phrase I heard recently is that for white people, it's like being born on third base with no outs. It's just, there's so much given to us by privilege. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
That does make sense. Is that Beverly who was speaking?
Oh, that was Lynn.
Oh, that was Lynn. Oh, go ahead. Thank you, Lynn. That's very important what you just said, and we'll come back to that in a second.
I just want to add one thing to what Lynn said, which is that I think it's very easy for us to think that we are progressives and the racists are those people, those bigots, those rednecks, those white power people. They're the racists. We are better than that, or we know better, and we're not bad like that. And I think this is a very, very powerful statement that she makes about the progressives being the ones who really enable the racism.
Thank you.
Bill, I saw at least one other person shake their head no when you suggested that maybe in other places white privilege or the systems of race that privilege white people might be reversed. But I wonder about that too, right? Like, is there a place on the globe that hasn't been influenced by the systems of white privilege and white supremacy, because it's intermingled with kind of colonialism and globalization?
Yeah, that's a good point, Katie. Dr. D'Angelo makes a big deal of focusing on the global hegemony of American culture, that American movies and films and military and colonial might has so pervaded the rest of the world that even African nations might believe in white superiority, right? So good point. I'll retract that. Katie Waldman wrote a nice article, a review of white fragility in the New Yorker 2 years ago now, almost exactly 2 years before anybody knew about the coronavirus. But she uses that as a metaphor for racism. She says that Dr. D'Angelo's vision is almost epidemiological. We play host to a pathogen that seeks to replicate itself. Like a mutating virus, racism shapeshifts in order to stay alive. When its explicit expression becomes taboo, it hides in coded language. I thought that was a beautiful paragraph. And Dr. D'Angelo has her own metaphors for racism. One of the common pictures she uses is of a dock that looks like it's floating on the water. It's just a flat surface. And that flat surface that looks like it's free floating on the water is made up of both colorblind and color celebrate statements. Dr. D'Angelo says it's almost as if white people are reading from the same script. She hears these things all the time. Some of them are about color blindness. I don't care if you're pink, purple, or polka dotted. Race doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not racist. I'm from Canada. All of those statements are colorblind statements. People also make color celebrate statements. I adopted a child from China. I was in the military. I lived in Hawaii. I lived among Black people. I lived in Japan. I went to Africa. Our grandchildren are multiracial. None of these things keeps you from being racist. And then she goes on to extend the metaphor, saying that the apparently free-floating pier is held up by pilings, right? By ideological presumptions and understandings that are barely even thought about anymore because they're so much a part of our American story. And so individualism is one of those pilings that holds up racism. Why would that be the case? What's wrong with individualism in this case?
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
It's Sally Campbell. I can't figure this out. This is something I'm thinking about a long, long time, and I feel like, in a way, white people, I never thought about whiteness before, really, in this sense. But it's kind of like saying, I didn't rob the bank. I just enjoy the proceeds. I don't know. It feels like all of us want to deny all this, and would that we could, but we can't. And we have participated, and goes back a long way.
Thank you, Sally. So Dr. D'Angelo doesn't like individualism because individualism's presumption is that we make ourselves who we are, that the tribe John talked about a little earlier doesn't have a huge impact on us. And the acknowledgement that we're part of differing tribes is very important to understanding how we got to where we are. Meritocracy is one of these pilings. We believe that if you work hard, you can make it. But that's not true, is it? Some people have to work harder just to be seen as equal. So these are some of the pilings that hold up the free-floating pier, including, most importantly, if you didn't get anything else from Dr. D'Angelo's book, you might want to talk about the good-bad binary that Lynn was kind of nodding at a few minutes ago. The bad-good binary. Racists are ignorant, progressives are educated, racists are bigoted, racists are progressive, liberals are progressive, racists are prejudiced, the rest of us aren't. We're open-minded. They're mean-spirited, and we're well-intended. They're probably old. The next generation will be better at this. The racist is probably from the South, but we live in Illinois. We live in the land of Lincoln, so we're okay. So once again, she wants to remind us that she's not describing racist as the kind of people who killed Emmett Till. That is a racist act, but that's not what she's talking about. You can be an educated, progressive, open-minded, well-intended, young Northern racist. Comments?
Yeah, I have one comment that this discussion has sort of just brought to the front of my mind. I was thinking in all my travels in various areas of the world, I never felt threatened, never. And I was in places that were all dark and brown people and what have you, but I just never felt threatened because, and I think it's because of that, the white privilege thing is just like ingrained, like, well, nobody's going to harm me, and it just struck me strongly that I think that's what she's talking about, is that you're unaware of your whiteness because you don't have to think about it. Nobody thinks of saying, well, he's Caucasian American, or he's, what I mean is just, it really was a revelation to me to think this way, in a different way, about one, whiteness, two, privilege, and the fact you don't have to worry because you're just accepted wherever you go.
Thanks, John. Other comments? This is just by chance. This was in yesterday's Washington Post. The article was entitled, "A New Generation Challenges the Heartland. Big Changes in Small Towns Are Fueling a Racial Justice Movement Across the Midwest." It's talking about how older baby boomers are moving away from small towns in the Midwest and they're being replaced by people of color. And the reporter interviewed a young black man named Zach Newsom, and he was talking about disputes between whites and blacks over social media, and white people tend to think of racism as the KKK burning churches and hanging black people. And so when you confront them about social media posts, they were just like it was a joke and automatically get defensive. And this might be the definition of what Dr. D'Angelo calls white fragility. We get very defensive. Dr. D'Angelo frequently asks Black people, what would it be like if you could simply give us feedback, have us graciously receive it, reflect, and work to change the behavior? Recently, someone said to her, it would be revolutionary. Just think about that for a minute. That if we listen to our friends of color and try to be gracious in our reaction to it, that is a revolution for Black people. I find that to be a very damning statement, and something we need to work on.
May I speak again? It's Sally Campbell.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I think that it's very difficult just to be friends with Black people because we don't see any. They're far away. I mean, I've been with a group for about 20 years now, and we are mixed, and we deliberately did that really to explore what we have in common. But now I feel like there's a division that is harder to get past it. You can't call. How many of us even see Black people very often? And if you do, you have to make special arrangements. You have to somehow. Where do you meet? How do you get? I've had breakfast with some friends, Black friends, and dinner, but it's never just you run into them or let's do that again, or it's just not that casual. It's arranged. Anyway.
Discuss amongst yourselves.
Bill, I was thinking about something. I actually haven't gotten the book yet. I'm still waiting for it. So in lieu of that, I watched about 4 of the author's podcasts. And in all of them, she was talking about the incident where she was making a comment about her Black colleague's hair. And her colleague, she realized at the end of the story and the conversation she was having with the colleague that she wanted to ask her how, if anything landed inappropriately. And she didn't say it that way, but she said something along the lines of, excuse me, she said, has anything I've said offended you? And she said in her podcast that just that question, and I think she followed it up with a few other questions, opened the dialogue. And because she's a diversity trainer, she's trained to, follow up and ask those kind of questions. But I literally wrote that down and said, wow, that's not obvious, but it's a building of a relationship. Whether the person is Black, not, of any other, maybe a different gender or anything. And she said, if we even do that toward building relationships, that would be big too. So it's stuck in my mind.
I was really fortunate last year when I was in school to be in a cohort of 2 Black women and 2 white women of all different ages. And we were all in separately in a diversity class together that was led by a Black professor who decided that I needed a little bit of work. I think that, quite honestly, I think she partly picked on me because she knew I lived in the North Shore of Chicago and she lives on the South Side. I think she also picked on me because I was older. And and I'm pretty outspoken in class. But it was such a gift. It was absolutely incredible. And I think the turning point for me personally was that I always believed in the American dream, because I grew up in a family without a lot of money. There were 9 kids in my family. My dad died when we were little. We all had to start working when we were 14 and buy our own clothes and pay for our own college. And we were pretty much out the door when we were 18. And so for me, I just thought, well, I did it. It's just about working hard. And to finally understand that I could do that because I was white. And I could do that because my parents worked their tails off so that we could live in a community that in Milwaukee, which is much like Wilmette, and had the best school system in the state. And that my best friend's mom went to Wellesley, and so she interviewed me. And so I got a free ride at Wellesley. I mean, all of those things were because of my whiteness. And it was really revelatory for me to understand that other people can work just as hard as I can, and they'll never get to the point where I did. And it's just really saddens me. And I'm doing a lot of reading, and I mean, we did a ton of reading in school, but I've read 4 or 5 books in the last month, kind of all the classics that everybody's reading right now. And each one just contributes to my learning in a different way, and a realization of how systemic racism is in our country, and how the intersectionality of race and class have made such a huge divide. So I just wanted to share that because I really, really feel fortunate that I had that experience. And I hope I can figure out what to do with it.
Thank you for that honest remark, Joan. I think that was very wise, what you just said. One thing that Dr. D'Angelo says is an advantage of being white is that if you are successful, as she has been in academia, nobody will ever say to you, well, you got the job because of your race. You know, even that was just so damning for us, that when we see a successful Black person, we think, oh yeah, affirmative action or something like that.
Hey, Bill, so I want to,
Well, go ahead.
okay. I wanted to knit together a couple of slides that you put up with kind of more of an optimistic or hopeful tone to them. One is that the quote in which the gentleman said that it would be revolutionary if these things started happening. I think it's pretty revolutionary and great that this conversation is happening today, and the studying and the reflection that is happening here. 2 is, just in the work that I have, I have the privilege of working with a lot of folks on the south side of Chicago. I live in Wilmette, but I get to do that from an education front, and it's and so I was talking about some of these issues last week with a colleague of mine, and she said, you know what? At this point, if anybody just tells me they're trying and they get it completely wrong, I don't care. I am so willing to give them grace because they're just recognizing it.
Hallelujah.
And the third thing I was going to say was there's a slide in which you talked about how racism is systemic, right? It's not individual, it's systemic. And when you have a systemic, when you have something that's systemic, there's a possibility of also changing that system through a policy, right? Through a smart, well-reasoned, thoughtful policy. So I do think that there are ways that we can continue to improve by thinking about those smart policies that can deal with this in a number of ways, and also just to understand that I think there are a lot of people out there willing to give grace.
Thank you, Mimi.
Sure.
I've been thinking a lot about healthcare in the last months, and I was interested in research that I learned about with work I do at Lurie Children's, that your zip code depends more on how your health care is and how you are born and lived for your life than your genetic code. And I think that's a very sad statement for the people who live in poverty all of their lives. And one reason they've had a worse time with the COVID in the getting the disease and dying from it than people in white, good zip codes. I don't know, it seems to have gone away.
Looks like the thing is frozen.
It does seem like that, Louis, that has to do with, I don't know why conversations about race are happening right now, right? That that this pandemic has maybe amplified the national and international worry about those kinds of healthcare inequalities, right? Like you see it, much more tangible, live, constant kind of way. And so it makes you question the whole system.
Do you know what I question, Katie? Why do we not worship alongside people of other colors? I wonder, this deserves so much conversation. I get it. But I think we also need to look at this as Christians. I don't hear that in the conversation. What prepares us to, address a situation like this better than anyone? And that's our Christian faith. Why? Now, this book is addressed to people of all, faiths and creeds, and, so I understand that. But I think if we find opportunities to worship alongside other Christians who are from different educational backgrounds, different colors, different, I think it goes a long way to build our sensitivities to our common humanity.
Yeah. And I think next week for sure we'll talk a little bit about how systemic racism or white supremacy is entangled in our theologies, right? So next week we'll talk about James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is similarly convicting about what it means to be a white person in America, and specifically a white Christian in America. But it's a big question, right, Herb?
Well, I think we have the solution. It's just, are we willing to talk about it?
Right.
I think Herb is pointing out a flaw in this book. I noticed this towards the end of my reading of this book. She never mentions God or church or spirituality once. I have a feeling she may not be a participant in faith, because otherwise, if she were a congregant somewhere, I think she would have paused to talk about either the harmfulness of American Christianity or the helpfulness of American Christianity. It's striking that she never even curtsied in that direction once.
It can just be very powerful when you have the opportunity to worship in a group where you're the only white person in there, and just realize it doesn't matter. It's a rare experience, but it can be very powerful. And I think that's the opportunity we have as Christians.
Herb, a long time ago at church, John Robert used to be head of our maintenance services. And one of the blessings that he brought all of us many, many years ago was he attended church in Evanston, and he used to invite us all the time to come down and worship with him. And many of us did, not often, but we would go down and worship with them. And that was just such a rich experience.
Yeah,
It,
really can be.
and I think that we need to find ties like that again, connectors that bring us together.
Yep, I agree.
This is a little bit out of left field. I was going to send something to Bill today. There was an article in the Sun-Times about the Negro leagues in baseball. I don't know if you know the history of them, but the guy who really got it off the ground was a fellow here in Chicago named Rube Foster about 100 years ago. And for many years before then, and so Jackie Robinson integrated baseball in 1948. There were Negro leagues with players every bit as capable as the people playing in the then major leagues. And obviously they didn't have the chance. And it was the hope of this man at some point that someday it would lead to an integration to leagues. And some people gave him credit. It's a good article in the Sun-Times. But because I've had a connection to sports most of my life, my father was a coach. That's where we ended up in Skokie. I've been involved with him. I spent some time in a major league clubhouse as a bat boy. Where there was integration back then. I just want to, I think Herb's comment is sort of relevant in the sense that I love what's happened in athletics. And I think athletics is the very fact of them occurring has led us to acceptances that wouldn't have been there otherwise because of the familiarity of interacting with people and watching people do things that we wouldn't let them do or we didn't know if they could do. And it's marvelous now. You don't question when a team is a college basketball team on the court has all black players. You don't ask the question because every coach in the country plays his best players. That didn't happen 50 years ago. And I think it's because you were kind of led maybe unwittingly, or in some cases kicking and screaming people did, but come to understand people as people more than anything else. And athletics has had such a critical role, I think, in integrating the society to the extent that it has. And there are a lot of positive things and a lot of progress that's been made in the last 50 and 100 years. And all you have to do is look around, and certainly in other elements of entertainment. But I know some people that have worked with trying to resurrect the Negro leagues and the history of them and celebrate them. So I'm a little attuned to it. So I just wanted to bring it up. I said it's out of left field, but good article today too.
Oh, you know what? I am currently involved with Faith in Place in addition to being on a green team for our church. And I say Faith in Place is a organization that encompasses all religions and all colors. And they had a summit last year that I went to, and they will have one again this year online. And it was beautiful. It had, rich and poor, black and white, Hispanic, Muslim, people all together, coming together for the earth. But they're also fighting social injustice and green, and they have other goals too. I think Faith in Place is trying to do what we're talking about doing, uniting all people. So I just want to make a comment on Faith in Place that we are now that we are now a part of, and they will be helping us with our green team.
I'll just make a quick comment. So I wrestle with this topic on many, many fronts. And simplistically, the comment made early on is that we all come from different tribes, and I wrestle with this human behavior, natural human behavior, and how do we solve all these things. But I mean, if you're used to just being with white people, black people are different, and that's kind of what prejudice is. And then you interact with them, and I think the sports analogy is a really good one, and you realize they're just like you, right? But they've been different. So I think they have appeared different. So hey, we clearly come from privilege and all that. You know, but I wrestle with what the solutions are. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that we have this belief in America that that you can get ahead given the opportunity. We all believe that everyone should have, opportunities. And so I think all the discussion, about realizing and thinking through, all the stuff that we take for granted that blacks don't have is really constructive. Then I have a much tougher time with the solutions, and I end up kind of saying, what we should be able to do is figure out ways to provide for more opportunity, legitimate opportunity. But these are all very challenging, really challenging topics. And the good thing is we're, as a country, acknowledging that and trying to make progress. So, but again, when you get down to the solutions, I think they're hard.
Thank you, Scott. I will chime in and something Mimi said a few minutes ago about, there are systems and systems can be changed, and yet the solutions are hard. For me, I think that's where faith comes in, because individually and even collectively as humans alone, we need God's help to create a more just world and to create the world that God envisions. And I think individualism, part of the trouble with that is that it leads us to believe that we can do things on our own that are complicated and hard, and they're systems of evil and oppression. And for me, that's where my faith comes in, with Jesus Christ being the one who can save us sometimes from ourselves.
Says 7:59 on my clock. Anybody want to make some? I'm going to bring it to a conclusion here in a second. Anybody has something they need to say? Speak now or forever hold your peace. And then Katie, you made it sound as if you're on deck for next week, right?
Yep.
Can you tell them how to prepare for that, or is there just show up, or?
So there's two things. One is the book by James Cone called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I think it's about 120 pages long. And if you want to see kind of a visual synopsis of kind of some of the important parts of that, another way to get at similar material is to watch Otis Moss III. He did a kind of a visual sermon about 6 weeks ago called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, a Requiem for Ahmaud Arbery. So it's kind of a sermon plus, a visual. It's kind of a visual sermon. It's really beautifully done. So I'll try to put those two things kind of together in our presentation and continue the conversation and kind of put it into a Christian context.
Katie, tell all of us, most of us probably know who Otis Moss is. Tell us who that is.
So Otis Moss III is the senior minister at Trinity United Church of Christ, which is at here in Chicago. It's in Chicago. It's at about, I think, 95th and the Dan Ryan. It's a large, maybe 5,000 or 6,000, maybe more member congregation, part of the United Church of Christ, a Black church.
Okay, thank you.
Katie, I think I mentioned to you, I watched what I thought was a really interesting interview. Bill, everyone remembers Bill Lehrer, PBS. He interviewed the author of The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
James Cone.
Yes, James Cone, about 4 or 5 years ago. It's a pretty good interview. It goes for about an hour, and it's good. I had never heard him speak, so it's easy to find on, just Google it.
Thank you, Herb. Any concluding comments? So God go with you till next Monday, the 20th, right, Katie? At 7 p.m. in this very location.